Everyone remembers the voice, not just powerful, not just precise, but something that felt almost untouchable. When Whitney Houston sang, the room didn't just listen, it paused. There was a clarity to it, a control that made even the most difficult notes sound effortless, a feeling that whatever she was expressing, it was real. For millions of people, that voice became something more than music. It became comfort. It became memory. It became a way to understand emotions they couldn't explain on their own. And for a long time, that's how the world saw her. Certain, unshakable, in control. But that wasn't the full story, because behind that voice, there was a different kind of silence. Before the stadiums, before the awards, before the image that seemed impossible to break, Whitney Houston was just a young woman shaped by music that came from somewhere deeper than performance. From church, from family, from a space where singing wasn't about perfection, but about feeling. And that's what made her different. She didn't just perform emotion. She carried it. But the moment that emotion reached a global audience, it changed. Not the voice itself, but everything around it. Because once the world begins to see you as something extraordinary, it stops asking who you are. It starts expecting you to stay that way. And that expectation doesn't leave room for change. It doesn't leave room for doubt. It doesn't leave room for the parts of you that don't sound as strong or as certain as the voice people have come to rely on. For Whitney Houston, that meant something specific. The more powerful her voice became to the world, the harder it became to separate that voice from herself. Because what people heard as strength was often something else entirely, something more fragile, something more complicated, something that didn't disappear when the music stopped. And that's the paradox. A woman who gave the world one of the most powerful voices it had ever heard would spend the rest of her life trying to find a place where she could simply be heard as herself. And what happened next would slowly begin to change that voice into something else, not in sound, but in meaning. Before the world called her the voice, Whitney Houston was surrounded by music that didn't need a stage. It lived in her home, in church pews, in the voices of the people closest to her. Her mother, Cissy Houston, was already a respected gospel singer, the kind of voice that carried authority without needing attention. From a young age, Whitney learned that singing wasn't about being seen. It was about being felt. And that foundation mattered. Because when she stepped into the professional world, she didn't arrive as someone trying to become a star. She arrived as someone who already understood how to communicate through music. At first, the industry didn't rush her. There was time to shape her image, time to decide how she would be introduced. And when that introduction came, it was precise. Her debut album, Whitney Houston, didn't present her as experimental or unpredictable. It presented her as something clear, elegant, controlled, accessible. Songs like Saving All My Love for You and Greatest Love of All didn't just showcase her voice. They defined how the audience would understand her. Strong, but composed, emotional, but contained. From the outside, everything looked effortless. The hits came consistently. The charts responded immediately. The recognition grew without interruption. But that kind of success doesn't happen by accident. Behind it was a structure, a direction that shaped not only what she sang, but how she was seen. Because Whitney Houston wasn't just being introduced as a singer, she was being positioned as an image, a version of success that could reach as many people as possible. That meant balance, between genres, between audiences, between expectation and expression. And for a while, that balance held. Her second album, Whitney, expanded everything. More success, more visibility, more confirmation that what she represented worked on a global scale. At that point, the rise wasn't just continuing, it was accelerating. But as the audience grew larger, something else began to change. Because the more people who connected with her voice, the more they began to define it, what it should sound like, what it should represent, what it should always be. And slowly, without being clearly visible, that definition became a boundary. Not one that restricted her ability to perform, but one that shaped the space she was allowed to exist in. At the same time, her career expanded beyond music. With The Bodyguard, she became something even bigger. Not just a singer, a global icon. The performance of I Will Always Love You didn't just succeed. It became permanent, a moment that people would return to again and again. a version of her that felt complete. And that's where the shift began. Because when a moment becomes that definitive, everything that comes after it is measured against it, not just by critics, not just by the industry, but by the audience. And once that comparison becomes constant, it changes the conditions of success. From that point forward, Whitney Houston wasn't just moving forward in her career, she was carrying something with her. An expectation that couldn't be lowered, a standard that couldn't be repeated in the same way, and a version of herself that the world would never stop asking her to return to. From the outside, everything still looked controlled. The success was still there, the image remained intact, the voice hadn't changed, but internally, the structure was becoming more complex. Because maintaining that level of perfection requires something that isn't always visible: consistency without pause, strength without doubt, control without break. And those conditions don't just define a career, they begin to define a person. At that point, the rise was still intact, but the space within it was starting to narrow. For a long time, the image held. Whitney Houston stood at the center of it all, voice intact, presence undeniable, success unquestioned. From the outside, nothing seemed out of place, but the higher the image rose, the less room there was beneath it. Because the version of Whitney the world believed in was becoming harder to live inside. At first, the tension was subtle. It didn't appear as failure. It didn't interrupt the success. It showed up in smaller ways: questions about authenticity, conversations about identity, a growing sense that the image people saw might not reflect everything she was. Whitney Houston existed between worlds. Her roots were in gospel. Her foundation was in soul, but her success had placed her somewhere broader, somewhere designed to reach everyone. And in that space, the expectations weren't always aligned. Some questioned whether her music was authentic enough. Others expected her to remain exactly as she had been introduced. Both directions pulled at the same thing: her identity. And over time, that pressure didn't disappear, it intensified. At the same time, her personal life was becoming more visible. Her relationship with Bobby Brown brought a different kind of attention, one that didn't focus on her voice, but on her life. Not the controlled image, but the unpredictable reality. From the outside, the contrast was clear. Whitney Houston, the polished global icon, and Whitney Houston, the person navigating something far more complicated. The more that contrast appeared, the harder it became to maintain the distance between the two, because the audience wasn't just listening anymore. They were watching, interpreting, comparing, looking for consistency between the voice they heard and the life they saw. And when those two didn't match perfectly, the narrative began to shift. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Headlines started to change tone. Appearances were examined more closely. Moments that once would have passed quietly began to carry weight. At the same time, the internal pressure didn't ease. If anything, it became more difficult to manage, because the expectations hadn't changed. The voice still had to be perfect. The performances still had to meet the same standard. The image still had to hold. But the conditions around that performance were no longer the same. Fatigue began to appear. The effort required to maintain control became more visible, and the space for recovery became smaller. There were no clear breaks. No pauses long enough to reset, only continuation. And in that kind of environment, the balance doesn't collapse all at once. It shifts, gradually, until the difference between control and strain becomes harder to ignore. At this stage, nothing had fully broken. The career was still active. The recognition was still there. The voice still carried the same power, but the structure supporting it was no longer stable in the same way. Because once the distance between image and reality begins to narrow, it doesn't stop on its own. And what comes next isn't just about maintaining the same level. It's about trying to hold something together that was never designed to carry that much weight. At some point, the balance stopped holding, not suddenly, not in a way that could be traced to a single decision, but gradually, through everything that had been building for years. The expectations never lowered, the attention never faded. And the version of Whitney Houston the world held onto never changed, but she did. The distance between who she was expected to be and who she was becoming grew wider, and that gap is difficult to live inside. Because no matter what you do, you are always being measured against something that no longer fully exists. At the same time, the conditions around her life were becoming more complex. The pressures of fame hadn't disappeared, they had multiplied. Every performance carried weight. Every appearance was compared to the past. Every moment was observed. And within that environment, there is very little space to slow down, very little space to recover, very little space to be anything other than what people expect. Over time, the strain began to show, not as a single event, but as a pattern. Moments where the voice didn't land the same way, appearances that felt different from what audiences remembered, performances that carried effort where there had once been ease. From the outside, those changes were visible, but they weren't understood. Because what people were seeing wasn't just a change in performance, it was the result of something deeper. A system that had been under pressure for too long, and when that pressure reaches a certain point, it doesn't stay contained, it spreads. Into the work, into the public image, into the way the story is told. At that stage, the narrative around Whitney Houston had already begun to shift. Not entirely. The respect for her voice remained, the recognition of her impact didn't disappear. But alongside that, something else had taken its place. Concern, speculation, a focus on her personal life that began to outweigh the music itself. And once that happens, the story is no longer centered on what you create. It's centered on what people think is happening to you. That shift changes everything, because from that point forward, every appearance is interpreted through that lens. Every performance becomes part of a larger question, not just how does she sound, but what is happening to her. And that question doesn't have a simple answer, because the reality behind it is never contained in one moment. It is built over time, through pressure, through expectation, through the constant effort to maintain something that cannot remain unchanged. For Whitney Houston, that meant living inside a version of herself that the world wasn't ready to let go of, even as she was moving further away from it. And that's where the breaking point exists, not in a single collapse, but in the moment where holding everything together becomes more difficult than letting it change. From the outside, it looked like instability. From the inside, it was something else, the result of carrying a weight that had no clear end. And once that weight becomes too much, it doesn't just affect what people see, it changes what they believe. And what they believe becomes the story. By the time the narrative had fully shifted, the music was no longer the center. It was still there. The voice hadn't disappeared. The legacy remained intact, but it wasn't what people focused on first. Instead, the attention moved somewhere else. To the moments between performances, to the appearances outside the stage, to the version of Whitney Houston that didn't match the one people remembered, and that difference became the story. For years, the world had listened to her voice as something constant, something reliable, something that didn't change. Now, everything around that voice felt uncertain, not because her talent had disappeared, but because the conditions around it had changed. The performances carried more weight. The expectations hadn't lowered, and the space to meet those expectations had become smaller. From the outside, it looked like decline, a comparison between what once was and what no longer felt the same. But that comparison didn't account for everything, because what people were measuring wasn't just a voice. They were measuring a moment that had already passed, but was still being used as the standard. And that kind of comparison doesn't allow for movement. It doesn't allow for change, it only allows for difference to be seen as loss. At the same time, the public conversation continued to move away from the work itself. Interviews, appearances, and personal details began to define how she was understood, not as additions to her story, but as replacements for it. The narrative had shifted from what she created to what people believed was happening to her. And once that shift becomes dominant, it's difficult to reverse, because every new moment is interpreted through that same lens. Every performance becomes evidence. Every appearance becomes a signal, not of who she is, but of how far she is from who she used to be. For Whitney Houston, that meant existing in a space where her past success was always present, not as something that supported her, but as something that overshadowed everything else. The voice that once defined her was now something she was expected to return to, constantly, without interruption, without change. And that expectation doesn't just affect how someone is seen, it affects how they experience themselves. Because when the world continues to reflect a version of you that no longer exists, it creates a kind of distance. between who you are and who you are expected to be. That distance is difficult to explain, but it is felt in every comparison, in every reaction, in every moment where the present is measured against the past. And over time, that distance becomes something else: isolation, not from people, but from the ability to exist without being compared, without being interpreted, without being defined by something that can't be repeated in the same way. For someone whose identity had been built around connection, that isolation carried a different kind of weight, because the voice that once connected her to millions of people could no longer protect her from being misunderstood. And when that happens, the story doesn't end, it changes again, into something quieter, more distant, more difficult to reach. And what follows is no longer about success or failure, it's about what remains. In the end, the voice never left. Even now, it remains clear, powerful, unmistakable. When people hear a Whitney Houston song, they don't think about uncertainty, they don't think about pressure, they hear something complete, something that feels untouched by everything that came after. And that's what makes the story difficult to reconcile. Because the version of Whitney Houston that lives on is the one the world needed her to be, not necessarily the one she was allowed to remain. That's the paradox. She became one of the most powerful voices in the world, giving people something real, something emotional, something human. But the more that voice came to represent strength, the less space there was for her to exist outside of it. Because once the world defines you at that level, it doesn't easily accept change, it doesn't easily accept difference, it holds onto what it knows, and asks you to return to it, again and again. For Whitney Houston, that meant living with a version of herself that was always present, always remembered, always expected, even when the reality had moved beyond it. And over time, that expectation becomes something else. Not recognition, not admiration, but distance, a separation between what people hear and what they understand, because the voice connects. But it doesn't explain, it doesn't show everything that exists behind it. It doesn't reveal the weight that comes with carrying it for as long as she did. In the end, Whitney Houston didn't lose her voice. The world kept it. It replayed it, celebrated it, turned it into something permanent. But the person behind that voice was never given the same space to change, to fall, to become something different. And that's what remains, not just the music, but the question that comes with it. What happens when the thing that makes you unforgettable becomes the very thing you can never step away from? Because when a voice becomes that powerful, it doesn't just define your career, it defines your entire story. And once that happens, the world doesn't just listen, it remembers only part of you.